There's some intriguing new reporting from the Washington Post as a new indictment against Donald Trump could come any day, one dealing with the events surrounding January 6th. The Post reports, quote, Mark Meadows, who was serving as Trump's chief of staff at the time, wrote to a White House lawyer that his son, Atlanta area attorney Blake Meadows, had been probing possible fraud and had found only a handful of possible votes cast in dead voters' names, far short of what Trump was alleging. The lawyer teasingly responded that perhaps Meadows' son could locate the thousands of votes Trump would need to win the election. CNN legal analyst Elliot Williams is with us now. And Elliot, why would Mark Meadows, involved in a joking conversation about the lack of widespread voter fraud before January 6th, why would that be important?
So humor is itself knowledge. He could not be joking about the fact that he thought that these claims were baseless if he didn't believe they were actually baseless. And so it certainly could be relevant evidence of, number one, the president's knowledge that he lost the election, but also, more importantly, number two, the knowledge of people around him, like Mark Meadows, as to whether what they thought as of the president's claims.
It gets to the issue of intent, which we've been hearing about so much the last few weeks, where the special counsel has been focused, yes?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, the tricky thing, John, is that humor, I think as you know well, out of context can be very hard to convey to other people. And particularly when you're dealing with text messages, the prosecutors are going to have to establish for a jury what, number one, Meadows meant in the text message, and number two, what the person who received it understood it to be. And that's a harder burden than you think, because think about social media posts or texts of our own or anybody else's from years ago. Out of context, they sort of don't really make a lot of sense. And you're going to have to convince a jury that this information can help establish proof of a charge beyond a reasonable doubt, and that can be tough.
So there was another line inside the Washington Post reporting that sort of had blinking red sirens around it. I want to read that for you here, Elliot. People in Trump's orbit have grown increasingly concerned about what they see as Meadows' retreat from the public scene as a prominent defender of the former president. He has reduced his public appearances, particularly on television, where he was once a frequent guest. He has not posted on Twitter in 5 months. Why does Mark Meadows make the Trump team nervous?
Well, the plot thickens. Now, certainly, Mark Meadows ought to make the Trump team nervous because he's valuable potentially as a witness. In general, when running an investigation, John, there are two types of witnesses. One, people who heard or saw things firsthand, spoken out of the mouth of the target of the investigation, or two, people who saw things secondhand. Mark Meadows falls in that first bucket. He would have been, number one, privy to firsthand conversations with the president, but number two, have overheard countless conversations that the president had with other people or views the president had expressed. Mark Meadows could potentially be a very valuable witness. Now, I wouldn't advise reading too closely into whether somebody chooses a tweet or not, or whether he goes on Jimmy Kimmel Live or not. But the simple fact remains, Mark Meadows could be an incredibly consequential witness when his boss is being investigated for any number of federal offenses.
For Mark Meadows, for his attorneys to let him go in and talk extensively to investigators, if in fact he did, would they have to get him some kind of immunity or potentially, and I don't want to get too far out ahead here, but some kind of plea agreement if potentially Mark Meadows had any legal exposure?
If he had legal exposure, of course, it would be in his interest, in his attorney's interest, to get some sort of immunity deal. Now, he might not, and prosecutors may not be looking at him, either in terms of the evidence they have or just the fact that they just don't think he committed any crimes. But if he is aware of, or if prosecutors are aware that he might have committed crimes, then certainly it's in his interest to get some sort of deal from prosecutors to either lessen the sentence they'll give him eventually or just not charge him at all with a crime down the road.
And again, we have no knowledge that he did commit any crime or not and is involved in a plea deal. We're just trying to figure out how he would talk. Anyone else you can think of quickly that would make the Trump team as nervous as a possible witness, as nervous as they might be about Mark Meadows?
So certainly, again, the White House chief of staff, if a president is being investigated, is critical. All of those staffers would have been incredibly consequential. Number one, Cassidy Hutchinson. We've heard her testimony at the January 6th committee testifying as to things she heard the president say. I would also say some of these state officials that the president had interacted or corresponded with. Brad Raffensperger in Georgia, there was an audio recording of a conversation the president had with him. I'm not saying it's necessarily the smoking gun that leads to the president's conviction, but it's the president's voice talking about the subject of the investigation that the Justice Department's looking into, and that's incredibly valuable testimony. So folks like that, anyone either around the president or that he spoke to, they ought to be concerned about that testimony.
Elliot Williams, great to see you today. Thank you so much.